Hey guys, we wanted to check back in this week regarding questions from you all about whatever's kind of on your mind. So we posted on Facebook a few days ago and said, hey, hit us up with some questions. What are the things that you guys would like us to speak into here at Exodus Cry? And let me see, who asked this question? Mary Schultz asked the question, what's the connection between sex trafficking and 50 Shades of Grey? So we're going to take on that question today, and thanks everyone who posted questions. Our plan is to get through most or all of those, and we're just looking forward to having this interaction here through Facebook Live. So this question though, what is the connection between 50 Shades of Grey and sex trafficking? I think the filmmakers would probably say that there is no connection, and that in and of itself is part of the problem. A lack of storytellers in our culture today connecting the dots between the stories that we're telling and some of these injustices that are happening in our society. When we look into the issue of sex trafficking, it's clear that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And when you start to break down, well, how does this happen? And then you have to look into sort of the deeper roots that are fueling this thing. And in the most direct sense, we can say that we know that this is a supply and demand issue. So on the supply side, you have high levels of profitability and all kinds of motivation from that standpoint. On the demand side, which is really, the primary thing that's fueling this, male demand for prostitution is what is fueling sex trafficking. So if you could end that, if we could stop demand today, if men stopped buying women and children for sex today, this whole issue would come to an end. The commercial sex industry would implode, and we would see the largest exodus of human beings from systemic oppression, violence, and exploitation that the world has ever seen. So I think that's where we need to look, is at this issue of demand. So why has demand exploded in our modern day, quote unquote, civilized society? To understand that, I think we have to look at the stories that we tell in culture. The stories that have become more accessible to us by virtue of media and technology and all of these things. And the types of stories that we're telling in this age. So when I think about 50 Shades of Grey, what I see is a story that I think represents and reflects what I would refer to as the message or the story of a pornographic culture. And I use pornographic culture as a technical term to describe and characterize a very specific viewpoint concerning men, concerning women, and concerning human sexuality and sex. And so when I talk about a pornographic culture, what I'm referring to is a culture that casts men as sexual predators, a culture that casts women as sexual objects, and that casts sex as a meaningless recreational act or as a vehicle for the abuse of another person in a more sadistic sense. And so it's the confluence of these three messages that we find in a pornographic culture, and that is contributing towards the socialization of boys and girls in our society today. And so, again, asking the question, why is there such why is the demand for illicit sex, the demand for prostitution exploding around the globe? You think about countries like Germany, where 1 in 4 men purchase sex on a regular basis, where in countries like Brazil, where 70% of men purchase sex. These numbers are staggering. And so why this explosion in demand around the world? And I think it has to do with the process of socialization. Socialization is the process by which we internalize the messages and the culture and the construction of our identity, our worldview, and our system of values. And so you can't just, a guy, like I remember having this encounter with a man who had flown to Cambodia to buy a child for sex there in Cambodia. And I confronted this man and I had this encounter, and I remember thinking after that, this guy didn't wake up yesterday and decide to go do this. Something happened in the course of this man's life. And so I think what we have to see regarding this issue of demand, and it's how it's fueling sex trafficking, but how has this demand become so prominent? I think we have to look at the stories that are socializing our boys concerning how they think about themselves, their conception of gender, what does it mean to be a man? And we have to think about the process of their socialization and the development of their understanding of their sexuality, and what purpose does that have, and what is that for? And so I think when we understand socialization and we understand the role that stories play in the process of socializing our young boys, you begin to start to see some of the connection between messages in pop culture, messages in movies, messages in pornography, the stories that we're telling in these contexts, and then the cultivation or the socialization of boys growing up into sex buyers. So there's a process, there's a socialization process in that. Becoming a sex buyer doesn't just happen one day. There's a lot of things that have been a part of that, him reaching that point. So when I look at a movie like 50 Shades of Grey, I see a movie that clearly reflects the three things that are represented in a pornographic culture. The casting of men in the role of a sexual predator. And by that I mean it's a story about what it means to be a man, a powerful man. It's a story about masculinity that is deeply rooted in men's entitlement to a woman's body. And we see that very clearly in the character Grey, a man who feels entitled to a woman's body and feels entitled to impose his brand of abusive sexuality onto her. So in 50 Shades of Grey, we also see the other two elements that I mentioned about a pornographic culture, where in a pornographic culture, sex is cast as a meaningless act, as a vehicle for abuse, and women are cast as the sexual objects. And so those are the three kind of disturbing, toxic messages of a pornographic culture, and that are consistent with this movie 50 Shades of Grey. And so when we want to understand the rise of sex trafficking, its prominence in our world today, you have to look at demand, and then to understand demand, you have to look at the stories in culture that are socializing boys into their conception of masculinity and sexuality. So if we have our boys growing up in our culture today and reaching, a point of adolescence, when they begin to look out at the world around them, to construct their idea about being a man, being a sexual being, all of these things, and they're watching movies like 50 Shades of Grey, what are we conforming our boys and our young men into by virtue of those kinds of stories? And I think what is clear is that we're socializing our young boys into very toxic conceptions of sexuality, masculinity, that many times results in various levels of participation in the commercial sex industry. So that's my perspective and the connection between these two things. And hopefully that is helpful for you as well when you think about 50 Shades of Grey. Well, it's just some kind of perverted story, but aren't there a lot of those out there? the stakes are a little bit higher than that. They're a lot higher than that. I think for us to be able to end this injustice of sex trafficking, we're going to have to begin to deal aggressively, realistically with the issue of demand. And in order to do that, we're going to have to look at the stories that we're telling in culture. And 50 Shades of Grey, to me, represents a reflection of the pornographic culture, the characteristics that are in that, and it represents the type of story that we don't want to tell in our culture. And that's why we're drawing attention to this, to say this is a really negative storyline. This is a very toxic message, and it's going to have a negative impact on the worldview, the values, understanding of the people who are exposed to these messages because of the way that it's romanticized. And so lots more to say about 50 Shades of Grey, and maybe we'll hit that again in another Facebook Live video, but I just wanted to deal specifically with this issue to answer this question of what is the connection between 50 Shades of Grey and sex trafficking. Again, hope that was helpful. We appreciate your questions, so keep firing them our way, and we'll do our best to answer them as quickly as we can. Thanks, and we'll talk to you again soon. God bless.